Hi, everybody. We're just going to wait a few more seconds to let a few more people come in, and then we'll get started. All right, since we have a pretty tight agenda today, I'm going to get started and people can join as they come on. So welcome everybody to today's webinar, Honoring Complex Connections, an Introduction to Integrated Adaptation Planning. So the 2021 California Adaptation Forum will focus on the Grand Adaptation Challenge, exploring key challenges faced by California's adaptation community and opportunities to overcome these challenges equitably and creatively. Over the next 4 months, we'll be diving into challenges related to Track 2, Integrated Planning for Holistic Solutions, and facilitating a series of interactive workshops for practitioners to discuss their shared challenges and identify potential solutions. My name is Whitney Brennan, and I am one of the Track 2 facilitators. I'm an acting landscape forestry program supervisor for the California Tile Conservancy. I oversee our work on large landscape efforts and landscape forestry projects, and I also work as a wildlife biologist and manage our climate program, including leading an effort to develop a Tahoe Basin vulnerability assessment primer and portfolio of actions. Also joining us as a facilitator is Peggy Nguyen. She's an environmental supervisor with the City of Los Angeles and a doctoral candidate in environmental science and engineering at the UCLA Institute of the Environment and Sustainability. Her work focuses on achieving climate resilience by adapting policy and business processes, developing climate tools, and training staff on the recommended adaptation measures and approaches for implementing climate adaptation projects. Also joining us as a facilitator is Rima Chakra. She's a climate adaptation program manager with Rincon Consultants and has experience in sea level rise vulnerability and adaptation assessments, climate action and adaptation planning, and community outreach and engagement. She has a wide-ranging policy background, having prepared or managed general plan updates, climate action plans, local coastal program updates, and a climate adaptation plans. So this webinar is the introduction to Track 2. We aim to highlight the complexity of integrated adaptation planning that takes into account multiple sectors, climate impacts, and cascading effects to deliver holistic solutions. So during this webinar, we will first highlight some of the overarching cascading and compounding effects of climate change. And then we will be looking to 5 speakers to discuss promising solutions and local planning case studies. At the end, we will have a panel discussion and audience Q&A session. Just so you guys know, at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A button and a chat button. We encourage everyone to use the Zoom Q&A button to type in a question for the panel discussion at any point throughout today's webinar. You can also upvote existing questions that you would like to see answered. In addition, you can use the chat function to engage in a dialogue with your peers. You can also chat Julia or Kelsey if you encounter technical issues. Now I'm going to hand it over to Rima for the next section.
Thanks, Whitney. So for Track 2, we'll be exploring the cascading and compounding effects of climate change and approaches to creating integrated planning solutions. Cascading impacts can occur when one hazard event follows another closely in time, with the second or third event compounding the conditions of the first one. So for example, there is a series of events that led to the deadly debris flow in Montecito in early 2018. And the start of these events was back in 2012, when there was the beginning of a multi-year drought that caused a large die-off of vegetation. After 4 years of that extensive drought, there was heavy rains in the winter of 2017, which caused the growth of fine fuels like grasses. Then the combination of a warm, dry spring and summer, that dried out the vegetation. Certain wind conditions which lowered humidity led to the Thomas Fire in December of 2017. This was followed soon after by heavy rains in January, which ultimately triggered the deadly debris flow. Cascading impacts can also occur when two events overlap. In September 2020, there were massive wildfires which were raging as a heat wave came through, all while the risk of more wildfires triggered large-scale power shutoffs. The combination of these events meant that people were exposed to poor air from the smoke, extreme heat, and inability to turn on their power. Cascading impacts can continue well after the event occurs, impacting our natural ecosystems, our food systems, water supply, economy, human health, and well-being. And these cascading impacts will affect us all a little differently, depending on our ability to prepare, cope, and recover. With our history of placing polluting land uses near communities of color and low-income communities, along with inequitable access to healthcare, jobs, housing, transportation, due to racially discriminatory policies, we have members of our community that are experiencing and will continue to experience climate change effects disproportionately. So between the complexities of climate change and its potential to pile up impacts spatially, temporally, and across service sectors, plus the extreme vulnerability of our most disenfranchised community members, we have our work cut out for us, particularly when you think about how our governance system has historically been set up to handle one disaster at a time, not cascading scenarios. So what will it take to create and implement truly integrated solutions that can measure up to these challenges? That's the focus of track 2. So today, as you heard from Whitney, we'll be looking at key examples of cascading and compounding effects, as well as case studies that approached climate change challenges in a holistic fashion. After today, you will see that we'll be convening 3 workshops that look at brainstorming together ways to arrive at integrated solutions, with the first workshop looking at breaking down silos across sectors and identifying collaborative planning and governance solutions. We'll look at steps that we need to take to build up resilience, not just in our built environment, but also our natural and social landscapes. We'll be exploring ways to address climate risk planning across different local plans, across regional plans, integrating equity, affordable housing, public health into our climate risk planning, certainly considering greenhouse gas mitigation alongside adaptation, and looking at nature-based solutions. The second workshop will explore approaches to creating solutions based on community needs and priorities and the daily lived experiences. And the third workshop will drill down into project implementation, focusing on designing, implementing, and adapting integrated solutions that are multi-benefits. So we hope you can join us for all of these upcoming workshops. And now we can turn to Peggy to hear about our speakers for today. Peggy, you're on mute.
Thank you, Rima, for letting me know
Sure.
and for identifying the key challenges that we're facing with the various complex, compound, and cascading effects of climate change. Today, we'll be focusing on wildfires cascading effects. I am moderating the panel discussion. We're very fortunate to have assembled on our panel today experts who can provide more in-depth insights on how to identify and address compound and cascading effects. Each of our speakers will be giving an 8 to 10 minute or shorter presentation. We'll follow that with a 20-minute discussion. During both the presentations and discussions, I encourage the audience to use the Q&A function to send either directed questions to specific speakers by typing their name in before your question, or more general questions. I'll be able to ask some of your questions live during the panel discussion period, but we'd like to be able to work on answering all of your questions. So just start sending questions as soon as you have them. At this time, I would like to thank our panel for participating today, and I'd like to take this moment to introduce you to these wonderful speakers. Before I do that, I'd like to queue up our first speaker, Bill Sambieda. He'll be speaking after I complete the speaker introductions. All right, so our presentations will go in the order listed, and I will begin with introducing Bill. Bill Symbieta is a professor emeritus of city and regional planning at California Polytechnic State University in San Luis Obispo. He brings a city planning perspective to the study of resiliency, risk reduction, and hazard mitigation. He serves as a hazard and risk reduction subject matter expert to the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the Chilean National Center for Integrated Natural Hazard Management, and the Japanese International Cooperation Agency. He was a co-director of the State of California Multi-Hazard Mitigation Plan that integrates an enormous range of state agency efforts under a common vision, and he also won national acclaim for early inclusion of climate adaptation. Our second speaker will be Stephen Torres from Southern California Edison. Stephen Torres is the principal manager leading SCE's climate adaptation planning efforts for the utilities assets, operations, and services, as well as the analytics group that supports resource and environmental planning and strategy. Stephen is experienced in wholesale and retail energy markets, greenhouse gas scenario development, climate adaptation and resilience planning, integrated resource planning, and renewable energy. He is a certified energy manager. Our third speaker will be Sanjay Mohanty. He is an assistant professor in the UCLA Civil and Environmental Engineering Department of the UCLA Sanueli School of Engineering. He is the director of the Subsurface Engineering and Analysis Laboratory, where he studies subsurface physical, chemical, and biological processes affecting pollutant mobility, and uses those concepts to engineer natural systems for the treatment of stormwater, to design bioremediation plans for contaminated lands, and to develop methods to mitigate the impact of wildfire on downstream water quality. Our fourth speaker, Gary Giroux of Los Angeles County. He was appointed LA County's first Chief Sustainability Officer in November 2016. Gary previously served as the president of the Climate Action Reserve, and he now serves as the vice chair of its board of directors. Gary's career includes service as the assistant general manager for the City of Los Angeles Environmental Affairs Department, and he also managed renewable and energy efficiency programs at LADWP. And last but not least, Jackie McLeod from the City of Watsonville. Jackie McLeod is the Environmental Sustainability Manager for the City of Watsonville. Her current focus areas are MS4 Phase 2 and industrial general and construction permits, the Zone 7 Flood Control and Water Conservation District for the Federal Army Corps Pajaro River Levee Project, environmental grants, state level lobbying on water, wastewater, and stormwater issues like hexavalent chromium and pollution reductions and prevention, city project management and grant management with the Santa Cruz and Pajaro Integrated Region Water Management, FEMA Cal OES Local Hazard Mitigation Plan, and the Bay Area Council Foundation Green Infrastructure Implementation Plan. At this time, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Bill Symbieta of Cal Poly. Bill, could you please share your screen? Bill will be speaking about the concepts of cascading effects and compounding effects in a way that's useful when attempting holistic approaches. He'll show you how to identify the linkages that exist and do something about them. And he'll also speak about the Thomas Fire in Ventura and Santa Barbara counties to illustrate all of these concepts. Please join me in welcoming Bill Symbieta.
It's a pleasure being here this morning. My title of my talk is Exploring Compound Hazards and Cascading Disaster Risk Analysis. The reason that we're interested in this is simply looking at the weather disaster losses worldwide over the last 40 or 50 years. And as this brief chart will show you, in 1980, there were $45 billion of weather disaster related losses. And by 2018, we have 200 billion. We've obviously increased past 200 billion, but weather and its related climate change effects is getting worse, so risk is increasing. So everyone is interested in this topic, and for good reason. attacking this idea of understanding complex risks, different frameworks are developing now, which is good for the people in the climate adaptation world. Here's one that breaks the risks into 4 big areas. One called interacting risk, interconnected risk, compound risk, and cascading risk. The climate change and compound risk we see on the left-hand side of the screen. But in this framework, you can look at your work as part of a series of different activities that over time connect. And the idea is that we don't live in a single solution world. This is sort of the recognition of the why we can't go towards silos, that we have to go towards some more holistic approach or integrated approach. This is a good place to start anyone's work and to figure out if I'm doing critical infrastructure, am I worrying about cascading risks, which we'll talk about a little bit later, and or compound risks. Okay, the Europeans have recently come out with a very nice little offshoot of this holistic approach called the dry hazard grouping approach. And in the dry hazard grouping approach, they just simply say, okay, we take weather data, hydrological data, and fire index data, and you break it down and you put it together and you get heat waves, what we commonly call heat waves from the weather data, hydrological variables, you get soil moisture and drought, and the fire index stuff, you get wildfires. And what you do with those is you keep moving through these until you get to compound and concurrent. This is not an approach that I'm saying is perfect. I'm saying it's in better thinking than we've had in the past, when, at least for the wildfires, we looked at suppression as the only method. This looks at climate and climate adaptation as a part of understanding and forming up solutions. So in California, I think this sort of dry hazard approach is worthwhile talking about a little bit more, or clustering. And we find that, of course, in the Climate Adaptation Guide 2.0, the focus on what's your real climate change situation. The terms cascading event and compounding events are still, I think, a little murky. We had a nice explanation earlier today, but cascading events are really extreme events in which the cascading effects increase in progression over time and generate unexpected secondary events of strong impact. The notion here is that a second or third event in a whole series of cascading events may cause more damage, or may be more important to retaining critical infrastructure, or maybe of more difficult to reduce the risk than other events in this sort of cascading chain. And I think that's what we have to understand, that the initial event may not be the event which we are more interested in looking at and lowering the risk. I'm saying that because my whole approach to this is disaster risk reduction, and climate adaptation is a method to examine that. Compound are 2 or more events occurring at the same time. But I think these definitions need more work and need to be revised to meet the climate change adaptation uses that we're faced today. Here's an example of, I think that we already had a little discussion of this before, but the cascading disaster example of the Thomas fires. Now, if we look at this diagram, in the right-hand side, we see the fire starts in December 1918 in Santa Paula, which is actually near St. Thomas Aquinas College. That's why it's called the Thomas Fire, and goes west, pushed by the winds to the northwest, just slowly but continuously, and it goes over 40 miles, 46 miles, and it takes weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks, and it ends in Montecito, where the fire advance stops, but you already have enormously heat events occurring, really difficult fires that create something called the hydrophobic soils. In essence, that soils which don't no longer allow water on top of them, the hydrophobic soils were in place when a small rainstorm, actually 15-minute rainstorm of about a half an inch, hits them. The water shears or skims along the soils, hits the inherent debris and the rocks and in the boulders and the canyons in the 5 water courses of Montecito, and causes the debris flow, which is where the 23 deaths occur. And that goes down and floods the 101 and closes it for 2 weeks. So this is obviously a cascading set of events in which the debris flow, event number 5, killing 23 people, is the worst part of the cascading events, but also points to the need for, if you have, this sort of hydrologic formations, that you should do something about it as part of the adaptation planning process. This is the same series of events, but we're looking at them in terms of a little chart where you see in December, this is 4th, the fire starts, and by January 9th, 101 closes, and here's the 101 closed. So it takes 5 weeks for this event to occur, but the event really starts as a small fire that gets pushed along by winds, which of course we don't study enough in California. I'm a big advocate of increased wind studies in all adaptation planning when they are needed, and certainly in Southern California they're needed. Okay, so there's one example of this cascading idea. Here's a second example of the cascading idea in a bigger context, and that's the Great East Japan earthquake and tsunami. So you have an initial event, which is basically an earthquake, a giant earthquake, 9.1, 129 kilometers east of Japan, and that causes a secondary event, which is an extreme tsunami hitting the coastal area at peak heights of 40.5 meters, which is just enormous, but that's an independent event. And then this causes landslides. The tsunami loosened soil causes landslides in valleys, and that knocks out the power to the Fukushima nuclear plant in this region. And then the plant also loses its backup battery system from the tsunami, and that causes this breakdown, or the core melts. And then the 5th event is the mandatory 30-kilometer evacuation zone that was put in place, later on going to 20 kilometers, and then water contamination, air contamination. So this is so you can see how the cascading effect can happen, where again, the collapse of the nuclear plant, in this case, the 4th event, is the most important thing that you're interested in. So the cascading idea is illustrated by these 2 areas. Is this tsunami big? I put this in here because this is in a small town in Iwate province, one of the 3 provinces in the Tohoku region. This is a fire station which got hit by the tsunami, and it's 3 stories tall, and the entire coating of the outside of the fire station got ripped off totally. And you can see 3 stories. I'm standing in the
Bill, you have 1 minute.
Oh, okay, there. So I just wanted to see that this is important. Okay, so the takeaways. Thank you for the 1 minute. I was getting toward the takeaways. Okay, what are the takeaways of my talk? Is the first, that the wildland urban interface hazard requires a joint fuel reduction and ignition reduction effort on the part of all of us. We all own this problem. I think one of the issues of this adaptation is that we're really adapting to a series of things. There is no WUI fire without fuel. There is no WUI fire without ignition. So we have to see this as a combined problem, not separate. Secondly, seeing risk reduction through a cascading event lens permits resiliency to be built into mitigation systems to identify particularly critical infrastructure areas of concern. So thank you very much. 10 minutes is a short period of time, but I'm sure we'll have more time to discuss this later on. Appreciate you listening.
Thank you so much, Bill. At this time, I'd like to introduce our second speaker, Stephen Torres. He is with SCE, and he will be speaking about climate adaptation planning for electric utilities. He'll be speaking about new CPUC mandates related to utility climate adaptation vulnerability assessment requirements, methodology used in conducting this assessment, climate projections and gaps, and examples of cascading events. He will also be speaking about transitioning from focusing on utility-owned assets to also considering broader community impacts, how utilities are taking a more holistic approach to climate adaptation planning. Please join me in welcoming Stephen.
Yeah, good morning, everyone, and thanks for having me here today. So I thought what I do is provide all of you with kind of an electric utility perspective on climate adaptation. That's kind of my remarks are focused on that. So I think it's worthwhile for you to understand that the Public Utilities Commission here in the state, which kind of oversees all the electric utilities, has a keen interest in kind of helping the state address this climate change risk. So they've outlined a set of requirements for all public utilities to follow, and it's worthwhile for you. And this is the framework that we're all sort of following in our, at least in our vulnerability assessment phase of our climate adaptation planning, and I'll come back to that. So the Public Utilities Commission, the CPUC, has defined the RCP 8.5 as being the right scenario for us to use in our analysis in terms of climate projections. The Commission has identified, like some of you have spoken already, about the importance of understanding the needs of our communities, and have asked us to file a community engagement plan, which we did back in May, and in the process of implementing. And in terms of the vulnerability assessment itself, the Commission wants us to look at assets, operations, services, and community. The Commission has asked us to focus on the primary variables of temperature, sea level rise, wildfire, precip, and cascading events as a secondary variable. They've asked us to look at sort of 30 years out as being the main sort of focus of our study, but as well as 10 years and 50 years as sort of bounding conditions. And we're scheduled to file our first vulnerability assessment in May 22nd of 2022. So to us, and I think to most people, vulnerability assessment is kind of like the first step in adaptation planning. You kind of need to know where you are before you start planning. So this is kind of the approach that we're taking. It's a common, if you would, framework. I'll just walk you through it very briefly. You first understand your vulnerabilities in terms of across those common variables. Then you sort of prioritize those vulnerabilities in terms of the adaptive capacity of those assets, operations, and services, and the consequence to get to a prioritized sets of vulnerabilities that you want to mitigate. And then you develop some adaptation options, and you make sure that you have community input in those adaptation options. Today, I'm going to sort of focus on this piece, kind of that has to do with climate variables and cascading events, just kind of to inform this forum. But that's this is the standard process that we all use when doing a vulnerability assessment. So in terms of how SCE is going about developing climate projections, so for the primary variables, very much leveraging the fourth climate assessment, and again looking at 3 time frames here. And using the sort of the historical baseline for comparisons. And then for cascading events, for sea level rise, obviously a different data set, the Cosmos data set, and it's then looking at the same 3 time frames. And then cascading events, it gets complicated, right? So, a combination of some RCP 8.5 climate data needed, as well as some secondary and third-party data sets to kind of be able to kind of inform more analysis. So a little bit on, since we're talking about cascading events, I thought I'd walk you through kind of our approach at analyzing debris flows, which is, again, is a cascading event, as Bill mentioned. And it's really kind of, it sort of brings three different climate variables together, right? It brings wildfire, precip data, and then sort of landslide data. So we wanted to identify areas that would be at most at risk from post-fire debris flow in our service territory. And what we wanted to do is kind of is there a way that directionally combining these three variables can give us a view on where do we expect debris flow risk to migrate? Do we expect debris flow risk to change? And again, this is kind of in terms of what we gather at this analysis is to identify areas of further study. And some of the things that we need to study is kind of watersheds within those areas. We need to understand sort of precipitation patterns on an hourly basis, not a daily basis. So there's a whole bunch of things we need to do now that we've identified these areas, but it's a good first step in understanding our exposure to debris flow. So as an example, so here's kind of what we learned, right? Nothing really surprising here. The Santa Barbara County mountain region continues to be an area that will be prone to debris flow in the future. But we also see the Sierras as being areas that have been, but will continue to be prone to debris flow in the future. And again, the takeaways from this analysis are that, these are debris flow prone areas, and they're unlikely to change dramatically from the ones today, but we do need to further study these areas in order to understand the actual debris flow risk to our assets, operations, and services. So thought that was good. Wanted to sort of briefly mention some climate science gaps, because I think the folks here have, there's some expertise in the room around those. These are the ones that we're hoping we were able to address with the state in the 5th climate assessment when, right, just more granular definition, directions, inland flooding, in terms of being able to understand, not just 100-year flood areas, but also flood heights, sort of just more information on the floods and the flood and the flood heights for us to be able to assess their impact. Atmosphere, rivers, again, vegetation in terms of how vegetation changes over time, and then shallow landside subsurfability. So again, some areas of where we think there's some further climate science development that needs to take place in order for us to better understand the utility risk in those areas. And then finally, we were asked to address how do you bring a community perspective to assessing vulnerability and develop mitigation options in an adaptation plan. And so we're looking at it through kind of this framework where we are working in understanding our key communities kind of resilience, resilience to, for example, losing power, which is kind of what would be an impact of one of these vulnerabilities taking place in our system. So we look at their exposure, the sensitivity, the adaptive capacity to get to a set of sort of like how resilient is this community to an outage. And then in parallel, we're looking at energy equity indicators that the CEC and other agencies have developed to kind of develop, okay, so when we look at a mitigation how do we score mitigation in terms of equity, right? With the hope to kind of get to bring those together, in which we're able to understand the equity value of proposed mitigations and how well it fits in helping us address communities with a low resilience score, and sort of bring that together to kind of inform, if you would, some of the investment decisions that we will be bringing forward to the commission to fund in the future.
1 minute.
I think that's that's kind of what I sort of prepared so far. So I guess I will close by just saying that obviously, as a utility, this is a very integrated approach and process. We have to have a very good understanding of our communities, adaptive capacity, but we also need to understand how our communities are planning to mitigate risk, because what our communities and cities and jurisdictions do will impact some of the actions that Edison as a utility undertakes or doesn't undertake. So I think the integration is key, and we're working with stakeholders to accomplish that. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Stephen. This time I'd like to introduce our third speaker, Sanjay Mohanty from the UCLA Sanyali School of Engineering. He will speak about assessing the impact of wildfire on surface water quality, nature-based solutions to mitigate the negative impacts of wildfires on downstream water quality, and integrated water, energy, and road infrastructure to make cities climate resilient. Please join me in welcoming Sanjay Mohanty.
Thank you, Peggy. Let me just. I'm very excited to be here. I'm probably the only person who is going to talk about a little bit science of infrastructure design. But I'm assistant professor at environmental engineering departments at UCLA. Most of the work that I do is related to water quality. And my research mostly on subsurface soil, like the few feet of soil that beneath our feet. I designed those soils in a way that it can clean water naturally using natural systems. For instance, these pictures that shows here at the center, we can design a natural stormwater treatment system that could be powered by solar panel, and that could also remove a lot of pollutants. And one aspect of that design is that it can also clean water that is affected by wildfire that you see on the top right corners. So I'll just talk a little bit more about how you can design these integrated infrastructures that could solve multiple functions and reduce the impact of climate change. So first thing, wildfire, anytime we think of wildfire, we think of air, and rightly so, because it is smoky, it releases lots of this dust and black carbons, ash into air, and that makes it very difficult to inhale. And those ash, once they are out, they are deposited at some point. And you can see in this left side of the pictures, that Harris fire, you can see that all the ash are deposited on one of the reservoir, which is used for for our drinking water. And there are many such reservoirs in California that we badly need to mitigate our impacts of climate change on reducing water quantity. And not only that, the cascading effect is also what happens many days after wildfire. You can see on the right side of the pictures, you have all these ash and debris. Every time it rains, these ash and debris will flow and deposit into this reservoir. And once they are deposited, that will change the water quality for many years. So how do you plan for those kind of disasters? So one of those pictures that you can see, the immediate effect is you can see fish will die if the pH imbalance change. There are a lot of other factors that could influence the fish habitat. But that's just the indications that if you drink this water, or that will increase the burden of how much treatments needed before we can supply this water for drinking water. So one of the concept is how we can prevent it. And so first thing is to answer those questions. We got to understand why wildfire has an impact on water quality. So this picture is just to show that on the top left, you have pristine land, all the plants are there. And the second top right, you can see that if once the fire happens, it burns out all the trees. And they leave behind these black carbons as well as ash on the surface. Not only that, it changed the way that soil behave after fire. It makes it more water repellent. So that means every time it rains, most of the water will not infiltrate into soil. So they will all, they'll become a flood very quickly, and they will remove all these ash and debris and deposit into the downstream. And the second question is, what is there in those ash? So just the illustration on the left side, although you can see those ash, they also contain lots of pollutants like polyaromatic hydrocarbons, many dioxins, heavy metals. These are micronutrients. First of all, metals like mercury and arsenic, they are micronutrients. So the tree naturally accumulate those in the bodies. So once they are burned, they are concentrated in those ash. So those metals will be released into water, and eventually they will be in the drinking water. So it's very important to think of this long-term cascading effect. When I say long-term, the one wildfire impact could last for many years, 10 to 15 years, based on how much debris are deposited in those surface water. So the idea here is that if we can capture some of those flow, we can remove them by creating this natural system, then maybe we can reduce the impact, long-term impact. So this illustration just to show that if you do nothing, these hypothetical lakes will receive all these wildfire residues, and that will change the composition. It will increase the disinfection byproduct formations during drinking water treatments, which cause cancer. So if you put this the natural system, that will prevent some of the debris flow into the lake, or remove them before it reaches there, you are less likely going to have these issues in long term. So that's the whole concept behind what we are working on at UCLA. And I just want to mention green infrastructures could come in a different shape, different form. So these are something that we normally do anyway in the city, building city. For instance, you can see in the single home, you have rain garden. If in a community, you have this bioswale and the roadside environments, you have parking structures. These are all designed to treat stormwater. And this stormwater could contain wildfire residue if it is nearby those wildfire affected areas. So if you design these systems in those upstream, two things will happen. First, it will not only capture those residues or wildfire residues, it will also provide other benefits like heat island effect, because naturally these are all plant-based system or nature-based system. This also serve other ecosystem functions like birds and all the animals. They like to live in nature. So if we introduce back the system there, then it will help in other ways. So another thing I want to mention that, one of the aspect is, these wildfires residue could also adversely affect the design of these green infrastructures. So for instance, if you dump lots of ash into one of your garden, you can see that plants will start dying. So now the question is how you can design the system in a way that could also stay resilient after the wildfire. So that's one of the things that we are working on in lab. So this is Renan, who is working on using fungi or fungal augmented media or amendments to make the soil more resilient for this wildfire residue effect. So the take-home message, again, this is a short presentation. I just want the thought process to continue. What we work on at UCLA is designing the system which serve multiple functions. So this is one of the projects funded by Caltran, which is nothing to do with wildfire. What we are doing is we are designing the roadside environment in a way that it could capture stormwater and treat them before it contaminates any surface water. And the same thing, so anywhere we go, we have roadway. So that means we have the space to integrate these nature-based systems. And so what we are working on is creating this ecosystem in a way that could remove pollutants from different origin. And wildfire is one such origin. So the take-home message is build infrastructure that solve multiple functions, not just one functions. For instance, here, before we design roadways for one thing, to drive cars and our logs, but now we can design roadways that can also clean water. And in future, this could be also part of an energy system, because we are going to drive these electronics cars, and those electric cars require recharging systems that could be solar panel. So we have space for all these multifunction. So when we design this nature system, it's not just for water quality, it could be also serving our energy need. So this is just one idea that we are working on. Again, these are very preliminary stages, but I want to make sure that others get this access. So that's my timer. Thanks, Peggy, for the invitation. This is my email. If you search my name and UCLA, you'll find me. So anytime you have any questions, I'm very happy to connect with you and answer those.
Thank you so much, Sanjay. At this time, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Jackie McLeod from the city. I'm sorry, Gary Giroux from LA County. He'll be speaking to us about integrated planning challenges and learnings from the county's vulnerability assessment and planning process. And he'll also be speaking about consideration of community lifelines when planning for cascading effects. Please join me in welcoming Gary Giroux.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the invitation, and really great to hear all the previous speakers. Really interesting and important work that's going on. So let me share my screen as well, and I'm going to depart a little bit from some of what you may have seen so far, but not too much, and talk about the work that we're doing in Los Angeles County to really look at climate vulnerability, but look at it on a comprehensive scale and a regional approach. And the reason that we take this sort of regional approach to these issues really goes to the level of complexity of the governance in Southern California. In Los Angeles County alone, there are 88 cities. There are multiple regional bodies like our transportation agency, like the air board, like the water boards. There are some 200 water systems. It goes on and on. And as a young analyst in the city of Los Angeles back in the day, I was asked to look at a bill proposed by then Speaker Willie Brown that would have actually combined the Metropolitan Planning Organization, SCAG in our case, Metro or its predecessor, the AQMD, into a single agency that really had land use authority. And the idea there, and it would have done the same thing in the Bay Area with the Bay Area AQMD and with the Association of Bay Area Governments. The idea that Willie Brown had at that time back in the 1990s was that that we really do need a regional approach to these issues, that we can't solve issues on a parochial city by city scale. And that always stuck with me. Of course, that bill didn't pass, and you can imagine why it didn't pass. Local governments weren't particularly fond of the idea that there would be some supra regional agency that would that'd be able to control land use decisions, but the idea certainly stuck. And so when I was hired to be the chief sustainability officer, we really took a regional approach to our sustainability plan, which is called Our County. And we really looked at how can we craft a sustainability strategy that actually works across the entire Los Angeles County area, an area the size of the state of Connecticut with 10 million people, in which more than 200 languages are spoken, to bring a coordinated approach to these issues. And that plan was adopted. We worked with cities. We held many city summits to make sure that we were trying to align our work as much as possible. One of the elements of that sustainability plan directed us to prepare a climate vulnerability assessment. And Stephen has talked a bit about the components as Southern California Edison is going through it, so I won't spend a lot of time on this slide, just to say We, of course, look at climate hazards. We consider the social vulnerability of particular populations, the physical vulnerability of our infrastructure, and then we also did this cascading impacts, and I'm going to touch on that a bit in a bit here. And I think Stephen talked a bit about this as well. You know, how you assess vulnerability is you're exposed to a hazard, you're sensitive to that hazard, and can you or can you not adapt to that hazard? And that's true for both people and for physical infrastructure. So just a little bit of the scope of our plan. We looked at particular categories of populations. We actually broke this down even further, but this is sort of the high level view. So what sorts of populations are vulnerable and how and why, and what are they vulnerable to? Similarly, what kinds of infrastructure is vulnerable and how is it infrastructure? How is it vulnerable? And so you can see this really was a comprehensive, broad overview climate vulnerability assessment that I'll drop into the chat after I'm done here. Is still in process. We held a public workshop about 2 weeks ago to outline some of the findings of the assessment, but it's not finalized yet. We'll be finalizing it over the summer. So I want to just take a second, because we use this term social vulnerability a lot, and I want to be clear on what it is and what it isn't. And it's certainly not an indicator of weakness or incapacity. It really is driven by inequities in the way we've designed our communities, in the infrastructure that we have, the access to benefits. It also recognizes or reflects the historic legacy systemic racism that exists within both governments and private sector. And those, of course, continue to this day, which we see in disproportionate outcomes, such as even recently during the pandemic with disproportionate health outcomes during COVID. So we want to make sure that, you know, social vulnerability is not a way of blaming somebody. It's really a way of reflecting the systems and the structures that we have in place today and how those have created disproportionate outcomes for particularly low-income communities and Black and Brown communities. So again, no surprise, and I think Stephen talked about this. These are the kinds of hazards we're looking at, and of course we know extreme heat is a significant issue and is going to get more significant, particularly here in Los Angeles County. Wildfire and drought and inland flooding, all of course are going to be more frequent and more destructive. And coastal flooding as a result of sea level rise. And we map this out. We'll have a mapping tool on our website that you can drill down into any particular community and see these sorts of climate hazards and where they're likely to occur. So really the crux of today is that we wanted to talk about these ideas of cascading impacts and community lifelines. So I'm going to take a little bit of time to just talk about that part of our work. And I'll say that this is, I think, really interesting and innovative work that was done by our consulting team and included Julia Finzi-Hart, who is now with the governor's office. But the key takeaway is that everything is dependent on everything else, right? We live in a complex, interconnected system, and we tried to map all of these systems and how they impact or how they interact with one another. And you know, this is obviously you can't see all of this; it's very complex. But this is an example of the way we looked at these things, and the arrows indicate an impact on another thing, which, as you can see, cascades out. So I'm going to dive into some of the details here, but wanted to show you this, just how interconnected this is. And the arrows are the causes. So something causes an impact on something else. And sometimes there are reinforcement loops as well, which we'll see. So the first thing we identified here is that electricity is critical, that it really influences everything else. You need electricity to move and treat and heat water in some cases, but you also, as you can see, there's a feedback loop here. You need water in some cases to generate electricity. But that was a key takeaway, that there are these dependencies within the system. And electricity is not the only one that's critical. The others, of course, are transportation and communications, and you can see that as well, and see some of the feedback loops. This is part of the analysis that we did. We didn't come out yet with recommendations. This is really meant to help us understand the circumstances on the ground, but not come up with policy and programmatic solutions.
1 minute remaining.
Yeah. The key thing, though, I think that was surprising to us, the finding that was most significant, was that, in fact, workers are the most important part of the entire system. That all of things that are connected, and we were looking at things like wires and asphalt, but it was actually worker availability that leads to breakdowns in the system or improvements in the system. And the key thing is that, for as an example, if there's a flood and it reduces transit service, that can cascade into having workers who can't get into the healthcare system or can't get out to service the electric grid. So there is that cascading and reinforcing impact that we thought was particularly important, and essential workers are absolutely critical. So that's it. I think I'm at time, and really appreciate the opportunity to be here today to present just a high level overview of some very detailed work that we've done. But I'll be happy to put the links in the chat, and you can dig into this in more depth. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you so much, Gary. Okay, before we transition to our next speaker, I just wanted to remind you there's an icon at the bottom of your window that says Q&A. If you have any questions for the panelists, please submit your questions through that Q&A icon. At this time, I'd like to introduce our final speaker, Jackie McLeod from the city of Watsonville. Jackie will be speaking about lessons learned from an underserved community on integrated adaptation planning, and she will be speaking about opportunities to integrate multiple objectives from planning to implementation. Please join me in welcoming Jackie.
Thank you so much. It's going to take me 1 second here to share my screen with everyone and get the slideshow going. Shoot. Okay, thank you everyone for your time. I am going to talk about a small city. I'm in the city of Watsonville. We're located in southern Santa Cruz County in the central coast of California. We are a full service city. We have 10 city departments that are serving our community, which is approximately 52,000 people. And when I say full service, that's all utilities, as well as all recreation activities as well. You can see that our community resides at the bottom of a very large watershed. We're in a 1,300 square mile watershed, and we're at the very end. We're in a mixed use watershed, meaning that the city of Watsonville is 6.6 square miles, and we're surrounded by agricultural, as well as housing, commercial, industrial. And so a lot of people that live within the city of Watsonville actually will be working in the fields surrounding us. We are a state recognized disadvantaged community, and approximately 18% of our community lives below the federal poverty limit. So we definitely cover a lot of bases at the city of Watsonville when we engage in this type of looking at plans, looking at projects to help our community become more resilient rather than relying on outside resources. One of the ways we do this though is as a city employee, I think I know I want what my community wants, but unfortunately, sometimes my priorities are more linked to what the utility needs rather than what the community does. So a big piece of our plan integration and our project implementation is really looking to the community to engage with them, making sure that we're meeting the metrics are, is this equitable? Is this inclusive? Through our climate action planning and local hazard mitigation planning, we were able to conduct stakeholder groups, bilingual surveys, community meetings, and we engaged a community advisory committee. The community advisory committee allowed an opportunity between the LHMP and the CAF development to sort of look at, well, what is an environmental justice element of our general plan? So we were able to parlay all these large planning efforts into how do we integrate across the board? How does this make sense when we are resource limited? We have very little staff, as you heard from my bio. I actually am doing all of those things on a regular basis. And so when we look across our plan sets, we have about 7 different plans that are separable, and they also live in the other 10 departments of the city. So you're having intradepartmental coordination issues, you're having different plans with different timelines. But we saw this less as a challenge and more as an opportunity of how could we streamline our planning efforts so that we're meeting the community's needs, as well as implementing projects and programs that actually build resiliency into a community that typically wouldn't have those resources available. Our biggest challenge will always be funding when it comes to implementing these projects, and we rely heavily on grants, as you'll see through my very short talk here. Anything we have done is been funded in partial or in whole by a grant. What's great about that, and one of my consultants on the project management side when I was working on the local hazard mitigation plan, which was FEMA and Cal OES funded in full, was that we had an accidental opportunity that we stumbled into. We were able to create a single jurisdiction local hazard mitigation plan incorporating our bilingual community and our residents. And we were able then to move that into our climate action plan. We adopt it into the safety element of our general plan. We then opened up the environmental justice element. And then the city was able to get a grant for green infrastructure planning, because through local hazard mitigation planning and climate action and adaptation planning, the opportunity exists to look at multi-benefit projects. And when we are looking at resource limitations and grant funding, multi-benefit is going to get us closer to resiliency over time and be more self-reliant during emergencies than before. When the CZU fire was occurring last August, many of the resources went to the North Coast. A lot of our residents in Watsonville were still going out and working in the fields every single day without PPE, but all of the other resources were taken away. So we needed to formulate an action plan of how do we keep our residents safe. We were able to also look at some of the evacuation routes. We also incorporated that into the general plan element. So this accidental opportunity really allowed us to, one, look at plan integration and align with many state legislative requirements that we were required to once we formulated our own local hazard mitigation plan. So what does this look like in practice? Well, when we look at project implementation and timeline, the idea is when you look at those 7 separable plans that normally would just sit on a shelf for a life, I live in public works and we don't do that. We are implementers. We want to get projects in the ground. We want to see active real-time implementation because we want to protect our residents. We want to provide the best service we can for this community. So we did create all of those plans with multi-benefit projects. With our ranking, the higher ranking went into those multi-benefits than the single focus projects. That's not saying that we threw away single focus projects, but we definitely want to make sure that we're going to hit at least 3 or 4 metrics in a single project. The next consideration is feasibility of implementation and considering those integrated adaptation goals and regulatory mandates. Some of our plans are requiring us, whether it's through grant timelines and deliverables, or whether it's through regulatory timeframes and permitting, to implement certain types of projects and programs within a time frame. So in order to do that successfully, we look to our partners to really help us. So we have a lot of really great partnership opportunities in the city of Watsonville. We have our local nonprofits, Watsonville Wetlands Watch. We have Regeneration, which is our climate action group that is a nonprofit locally. And then with those partnerships and that implementation, we'll look immediately to grant funding. And we're forever grateful to the federal government and the state of California for always providing funding for communities like ours. We are not a small disadvantaged community. We are a larger disadvantaged community. And sometimes when we look at those definitions, they change across the board, but the state of California has stayed consistently, and that has allowed us to implement grant projects that get us closer to resiliency. But along with that, there were a lot of challenges and there were some lessons learned. While funding is beneficial, and we do look to the state and federal government for funding, it still is also critical when our grants are getting scored. We don't always get funded. So then it's looking at opportunities within our daily operations of, if we can't implement a project, how can we improve operations and maintenance so that we can also work on maintaining our wet basins, our dry basins. There were a number of interdepartmental conflicts and priorities. What I'm working on may not be what police and fire think is important, especially if we look at the natural disaster that was the ZU fire. We were lending mutual aid to the northern Santa Cruz County, while at the meantime, we still had COVID occurring down here. We still had to think about our residents. So those those conflicts and priorities have to be taken. And when we think of holistic planning, that's a perfect example. When we look at some of these alignments of our project priorities within a regulatory framework, I've said this many times, each agency has a specific discrete reporting requirement that when you're resource limited and you have to submit updates on your plan rather than implementation, it's at conflict with what the goal of that plan was in the first place. So the plan is to get your community closer to climate resiliency, close to natural hazard resiliency. But when you're just updating constantly on a mitigation matrix rather than implementing, are you actually getting closer to planning and adaptation or implementation, pardon me. So I've asked many people, is there a way to have agencies sort of integrate their own planning on the state side so that when we're reporting, we're not reporting on different timeframes? We also consistently are managing the community and city council's expectations from our planning to implementation. The idea is when we start a plan, it may be, we have short, medium, and long term. And as municipal people, we understand what that means. The community, when they see our mitigation strategies, want action now. And so action now doesn't have to be a full project. It has to be meaningful engagement. So it's looking at, well, what can we do now to get us towards that project? Council expectations are definitely the most challenging because they're representing our constituency. So I go back to that third slide where I say community engagement. The council represents the community, and when they want us to do something, it bumps the priority up, and we try to make sure that it stays within the time frame of our plan sets that we're doing.
30 seconds remaining.
Awesome, and I'm done. So thank you for your time today. I really appreciate it, and if you have questions, I'm happy to answer them. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jackie. At this time, I'd like to invite all of our panelists to please unmute and join the panel discussion. And if you're able to turn on your videos. Our first question is, wildfire is a cascading effect of climate change, as are drought and extreme weather. What recommendations do you have about integrated planning and holistic solutions for drought and extreme weather for any of the following: people, infrastructure and built environments, agriculture, or natural systems? And I'd like to ask Bill to start us off.
Okay, good start off question. So I've been working on a framework here that is called the fuels ignition framework. And there's two types of fuels that we have to look at. And those are natural fuels, which are trees, bushes, and grasses, and then built environment fuels, and that's houses and structures. And we have to understand that both these fuels have to be managed in a way that we haven't managed them before. We've allowed, especially on man-made fuels side to say, you build a house, you build it under these codes, and after that, you don't have to do anything with it. If you want to protect yourself, you do. You clean out 30 or 50 feet away from your house. That's not enough. You have to sort of look at those, what kind of fuels you have over time and how they would ignite. And I think that this is where the ignition part of the analysis has been really weak, and we have to increase that. And I think in the WUI, the problem has to be because you don't take winds and the fact that the wildfires are part of the safety system that you have to address. And we've sort of allowed ourselves to say there's urban fires, which they, local fire departments will take care of, and then there's non-urban fires, which somehow CAL FIRE and someone else will take care of. That's not integration at all. And so that we have to look at this as looking against the fire regime. This is a criticism of how land use planning is done in California, because subdivision processing in California allows you to do an enormous amount of things having to do with the design and the look and the view and the protection of buildings. And it has very little to do with lowering the risk of WUI fires and not allowing building in certain areas, which we have an analogy with flooding in California. If you build in the floodplain, you have to basically demonstrate that you're going to mediate the impact of floods. In buildings, we demand that you build buildings over 4 stories in a structural way, that you don't give people an option out. So I think that we need a lot more work on integration of this, but really by looking at the fuels ignition framework and bringing in winds a lot more than we have ever done, because all the big fires in California in the last 10 years have a real wind component, which is never, ever, I haven't seen one subdivision review process in California which actually says you have to do a wind study in here, and you have to sort of figure out the corridor of wind where you're going to put this development or these human built fuels.
Thank you, Bill. I think Stephen's presentation actually included a
yes.
mention of that as well. Is there
So
someone?
that's good. That's good because the utilities sort of understand that, but they don't understand how to get it into the public regulatory process.
Yeah, so as we look at wildfires, obviously, or CalAdapt data or climate projections are do a fairly good job at sort of the pick and summer fires, but again, they don't capture the impact of wind. So I think we need a much more detailed view of wind as it relates to how does it impact wildfire ignition over the future, and sort of incorporating Santana winds into our future wildfire projections. I think that's an important gap that we need to address as a group. And then the second one being we take wind has impacts in other dimensions. So I think once we have a better understanding of wind, we could get a better understanding of some of the other cascading events that are associated with wind.
Thank you. Were there any other panelists who wanted to speak to the first question? Okay, if not, I'll go ahead and move on to the second question, which is, given the interconnected nature of climate impacts and sectors and the siloed nature of agency departments working on adaptation, do you have any recommendations for effective coordination?
I can start with that one, and I don't know if it's effective or not, but it's coordination, and maybe that's where you start. We've done a couple of things in my talking points. I raised this idea of engaging on a regional scale all of the cities to make sure that we're talking to one another, trying to row in the same direction as much as possible and have a common approach. And so that's part of it. But even internally within the county, one of the things that we've done is we've brought all the county departments together, some 40 departments, on a monthly basis to talk about these issues and make sure that we're at least aware of what other county departments are doing. And as part of our sustainability plan, when the board adopted it, it actually told department heads that they would be, as part of their annual performance reviews, they would be held accountable for what they were doing to implement the sustainability plan. So as Jackie points out, these kinds of plans can sit on a shelf very easily, but to get to implementation, you have to have a strong carrot and sometimes a stick. And annual performance reviews of general managers is one way of getting there to make sure that the work is actually being implemented. And then the last thing I'll say, and I don't want to take up too much time here, is we've adopted in Los Angeles now 4 major funding measures over the past few years. One for transportation systems, one for stormwater capture and management, one for building out parks and open space, and actually 2 for homelessness. We've created a task force, and oddly enough, those 4 measures are W, H, A, and M, so we call it the WHAM task force. But we're actually working to try to say, we've got a lot of money to do a lot of things here. Why don't we do it in an integrated way? And we can recognize that there's a transportation and a stormwater and a parks and open space and a homelessness impact to some of the work that we do.
Yeah, I'm gonna sort of pile into what Gary's saying and address local jurisdictions in Southern California. So obviously, as I mentioned before, the first step is to understand your vulnerabilities as local jurisdictions. But having gone through this process, this is a complex, people-intensive process in which city planners, may not be well equipped to take on the work associated with this. So working with LARC, working with CAF, working with the different Southern California and with this body to sort of develop some common approaches, some share resources around climate projections to enable all local jurisdictions to conduct assessments so we all can understand vulnerabilities and at-risk assets, operation services that we need to address. Then we need to integrate those mitigations, right? So I always talk about the example of, let's just take the city of Huntington Beach. Well, if the city of Huntington Beach decides to build a 14-foot wall across all their beaches to deal with sea level rise, then Southern California Edison will probably do a different mitigations in the substations around that area, right? So what is the right way to mitigate to effectively and efficiently invest dollars for the benefits of our communities is something that we need to continue to work on.
And I have a quick follow-up too. When we talk about coordination, in my division, it makes sense when I say sustainability and when I say integration and planning and adoption. When I talk to my other departments within the city or even to my public, I have to sort of look at it as we're required to do this anyway. We need to make our communities more resilient. We also need to make sure that our community is able to withstand any challenges. So I try to get a lot of buy-in from my other departments on this serves you as well in the long run, rather than make it a sustainability argument, because that falls hollow a lot of times. Again, it's that priorities that we're looking at within the city that my sustainability measures sometimes don't align with, well, we have how many plan sets to look at. So getting everyone at the table and having that buy-in of this is going to help you long-term to get your workflow as well as serve our community seems to be helpful for the city of Watsonville.
I have to say, I'm very impressed by Watsonville because it demonstrates and that a modest sized city, 52,000 is a modest size in California, can move forward when they actually accept integration and non-silo approach to things. And one of the first, good examples of them, I mean, other cities have done this, but the integration of the LHMP and the safety element and the climate action plan as one integrated document, focused on safety and different components. And they should be, it's a good model, because when you put this sort of, they all basically deal with addressing risk in a way, and lowering risk in different ways. Just like the UCLA water studies lower risk of contamination of your aquifer by putting clean water back into the aquifer rather than contaminated water. So if you take this risk approach and locally and say we're all interested in lowering the risk, because once we lower risk, we have more confidence in the decisions we make going forward. That's the function of lowering risk, is increasing the confidence in the decisions going forward, and the costs of making a bad decision. And so I think, Watsonville's experience really should be examined more closely and shared about how that gets done.
Thank you, Bill. Does anyone
Thank you.
else? Oh, sorry, Jackie.
No, I just wanted to say thank you. We always appreciate, we want to be leaders in a lot of what we do. So we appreciate that feedback.
All right, let's move on to the third question. The complexity of climate impacts can be challenging enough for planners to tackle. How do we communicate about cascading and compounding impacts to communities who are focused on addressing their own needs?
Yeah, so I can start. So this is where the commission was smart enough to kind of ask us to, in parallel with vulnerabilities assessment, to develop and engage in a community engagement plan. We need to, the community engagement plan has to have kind of a couple of objectives. The first one is to help our communities or more disadvantaged or vulnerable communities understands the risk of climate change, and then to consult with them, to engage them in assessing mitigation options, to ensure that those mitigation options do not overburden those communities in any way, or to lessen their burden. So I think there's a role for community engagement to, if you would, bridge that gap.
Yeah, and I think to add on to that, really the work that we're doing brings this down to a local level. I mentioned a mapping tool that we're going to have on our website, where you'll be able to see your own neighborhood and see the impacts in your neighborhood. And it's really that understanding those sort of, how does it affect me and my community, even though we recognize this is a much broader interconnected system. I think people intuitively recognize that the system is interconnected and complex, but they want to know, what does that mean for me and my neighborhood? And when we went out, we did a number of listening sessions. We had an advisory group. We had any number of ways of engaging the community. But we did have a woman who represented the Association of Rural Town Councils in Los Angeles County, part of our advisory group, and did some listening with her and understanding the impacts in the rural parts of Los Angeles County and what happens during a PSPS event and when the batteries go out on the telecommunications tower, and how do you get information about wildfire and whether to evacuate or not, really was eye-opening, and it played into that integrated analysis that I showed you a piece of. And I think it's that understanding, how do you, one, listen to what community is saying in its neighborhood, but also how do you reflect that back to those neighborhoods?
That's a very good point. Does anyone else want to weigh in on that third question? Okay, if not, I'd like to close our panel discussion and invite you to look at the questions that remain. There are about 15 questions that remain in the Q&A chat room. And if you can answer any of them, please do so. And what I'll do right now is just quickly summarize my takeaways from this incredible webinar. We had 4 incredible speakers who gave really good examples of how we could implement integrated planning to achieve more holistic solutions. And I've been taking notes, so I'm going to go ahead and go through those while you work on answering questions. Okay, so here's what I learned. I learned that we should use the cascading and compound effects lenses to identify impacts to the economy, communities, environment, technological systems, and critical infrastructure areas of concern. And we should address short-term and long-term impacts. I also learned that integrated climate adaptation planning and action includes urban greening, urban forestry, organic waste and compost management, green infrastructure, environmental justice, hazard mitigation, recycled water, complete streets, mutual aid agreements, social services, water, wastewater, electricity, transportation, communications, community resilience and readiness planning, public health and safety, legislative efforts, economic and social justice, workforce development, workforce transportation and availability, safety planning, water pollution mitigation, biodiversity, wetlands, and wildlife habitat. So there's a lot to think about when you're doing climate adaptation planning and a lot of parties to invite to the table. I also learned that you should tie your plans to the most recent scientific findings, such as the California Climate Assessment statewide and regional level results, and use the different representative concentration pathways, or RCPs, for scenario planning. RCP 8.5 is the worst case scenario that you could plan for, and you should plan for different RCPs in different timeframes using adaptive pathways. I learned that that we need more data, and specifically we need more detailed data in the climate change assessments, especially regarding wind, atmospheric, river, vegetation, flooding, and shallow slope stability and landslide susceptibility. Our utilities can look to the CPUC's Climate Adaptation Order instituting rulemaking for guidance for integrating climate adaptation into planning and operations. I learned that we should make contact with disadvantaged and vulnerable communities and develop a community engagement plan together with those communities. I learned that we should measure sensitivity, exposure, and adaptive capacity. I also learned that we should consult with disadvantaged communities during the vulnerability assessment so that we can make sure that equity and adaptive capacity are included, and that the City of Watsonville shared with us some best practices for inclusivity and equity. Some metrics that could be used for measuring this part is community resilience score, multiple benefits, project equity scoring, and community resilience and energy equity scoring to make risk-based investment prioritization. One way to engage community is through partnerships and grant funding. Partnerships are helpful in meeting tight grant deadlines and timelines. I learned that the vulnerability assessment should consider assets, operations, communities, and services, and it should be done locally as well as regionally. Case studies were provided by a small city and a large county during our webinar. For debris flows, hourly precipitation is needed for directional debris flow modeling. We also need to manage wildfire at the urban wildland interface in a more proactive manner than suppression. And we need a joint fuel and ignition reduction effort. Wildfire can cause surface and groundwater pollution for many years afterwards. This can impact our water supply, treatment plants, and fish and game abundance and health. Science and engineering research and studies are resulting in better ways to naturally clean water with some engineering improvements. For example, green infrastructure, wetlands, forests are helpful for resiliency and biodiversity. Leadership is important and regional planning is important. This was a lot of very helpful information that we can use to enhance the way that we're planning for climate adaptation. And I'd like to thank the speakers and all of you again for sharing this experience with us. Right, and at this point, I'd like to transition back to Whitney Brennan, who will make closing remarks. Thank you.
All right, thank you everyone for participating today. We appreciate it. We really appreciate the panelists joining us today. You had some great presentations and great discussion at the end. I think we learned a lot, and we look forward to diving deeper into some of these issues over the course of the track. Over the next 4 months, we'll be holding workshops to interactively work through some key topics we face in today's adaptation planning world. We hope you can join us for Track 2's workshops over the next few months. The first one will take place Thursday, July 29th from 10 to 12. Thank you everyone for joining us today, and we hope to see you again in the future.
All right. Appreciate the invitation and the ability to share some ideas with everybody.
Yeah, it's great to be part of this STEAM panel and appreciate the chance to share our perspective.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Please stay connected.
Okay.
Whitney and Julie still here, Rima still here. Good job, ladies. Good job. It went well.
All right. I didn't know if it was over or not.
We still have 29 people on, or 30.
I have a question. Peggy, do you want any other comments on all these questions that were lined up in the Q&A?
I think if you'd like to answer them, I'm not sure that they're on to listen anymore.
Okay, that's okay. I wasn't quite sure how you wanted to close it because there were a lot of questions,
Sure.
which was good. It just some of them I could provide an answer, others I couldn't. I just didn't know.
Yes, I understand. Thank
Yeah.
you. Thank you for your insights and contribution. We really appreciated having you on the panel.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.
Okay, so Leslie Bryan said it'd be great to get the questions and answers sent out to attendees. Can we do that? I think Julia's gone, right? I see Juliet. Should we, does she capture the questions? Do you know? Hi, Juliet. Still recording too.
Oh shoot, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize I was double muted. Hi there, sorry. Can you all see the questions or?
I can see the questions, but if we respond now, will people won't be able to see the answers if they've logged off, correct?
That's correct. I'm gonna take a screenshot of all the questions right now.
Okay.
And I can send them. Sorry, I didn't realize I was double muted. I was showing you that I was multitasking because our chinchilla got hurt I was theoretically on vacation last week, but that got canceled because I hurt my chinchilla.
Sorry to hear that. Oh.
So I was a little distracted, but let me grab these questions and then I'll send an email with all of them. And then, I mean, I think it would be wonderful if if the panelists would be willing to take some time to answer any ones that weren't responded to.
Okay.
That'd be great.
All right, that sounds like
I
a
don't
good
have
idea.
access behind the scenes because this is Julia's
Right.
Zoom, but
Got it.
just gonna grab it.
Thanks for doing that.
Great job. Yeah.
You're done?
Is
Okay.
Julie gonna stop the recording?
I think I'm the host now. I should stop it.
Okay.
Sorry.
If you're the host, you may be able to access the